The words landed without warning. I want a divorce. Xavier stood in the kitchen doorway like he had already made peace with what he was about to destroy. His coat was still on. His hands stayed buried in his pockets. Across the room, Emily froze beside the counter, one hand instinctively pressing against the curve of her 6-month pregnant belly. Dinner sat untouched on the table. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at the man she married, waiting for him to say something that would make the sentence make sense. But Xavier only looked tired, detached. There's someone else, he added quietly, and she fits my world better. The room felt smaller after that. Emily slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair, her mind racing through memories, promises, and the tiny life growing inside her. What she didn't know, what Xavier didn't know, was that the woman he was walking away from had just inherited $50 million. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, a pregnant wife had just been abandoned. And if you were sitting at that table with Emily, I want you to tell me honestly, would you forgive a man who did this? Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you stories that mean something as I continue learning and improving every day. If this is your first time watching, take a moment to comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far a storytelling family reaches. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you can officially join the Mr. Graham community. We share stories here that remind us how strong people can be when life tries to knock them down. Now let me take you back. Long before that kitchen, long before that painful night, to the beginning of Emily's story. Some childhood memories arrive with bright lights and loud moments. Emily's memories arrived with music, not the kind that blasted through speakers at parties, but the warm, familiar sound of old records spinning slowly in a small living room. The kind of songs where the singer sounded like they had lived every word before ever stepping into a studio. Motown filled the apartment where Emily grew up. On Sunday mornings, those songs floated through open windows while the neighborhood woke up together. South Atlanta had that kind of rhythm. It wasn't a wealthy place. Most families worked long hours, but doors stayed unlocked during the day. Children rode their bikes through the same streets their parents had grown up on, and everybody knew which house made the best Sunday dinner. Emily's home sat on the second floor of a modest brick apartment building near a row of tall oak trees that shaded the sidewalk. Inside, life was simple. A small couch, a wooden dining table that had a few scratches from years of use, a shelf of records beside the window, and always, somewhere in the background, music playing softly. Her mother loved music. Some evenings after work, she would slide a record onto the player and hum quietly while cooking dinner. The smell of collard greens, baked chicken, or sweet potatoes often filled the apartment while the melodies drifted through the rooms. Emily learned early that music could turn an ordinary day into something peaceful. Her mother raised her alone. There had never been a father in the picture, at least not one Emily remembered, and while some children asked questions about things like that, Emily never felt like something was missing. Her mother filled every space that mattered. She worked long shifts, sometimes 2 jobs in the same week, yet she always found time for the small routines that made Emily feel secure. Before school, her mother would sit behind her on the couch and braid her hair carefully. "You carry yourself with pride," she would say while tying the final braid. Those words stayed with Emily. They weren't spoken loudly. They weren't dramatic lessons delivered like speeches. Just simple guidance that slowly shaped the way she moved through the world. On Sundays, they went to church. The small brick church sat only a few blocks away, and by the time Emily was 8 years old, she knew the walk so well she could have done it with her eyes closed. Church mornings were lively. Women in elegant hats filled the pews. Children whispered to each other until someone's grandmother tapped a shoulder and reminded them to behave. The choir sang with voices that seemed to lift the entire room. After the service, the church parking lot turned into a gathering place. People laughed. Plates of homemade food appeared from nowhere. Someone always had a story about something funny that happened during the week. That community became an extension of Emily's family. If she scraped her knee riding her bike, 3 neighbors showed up with bandages. If she forgot her lunch money, someone's auntie quietly handed her $1 before school started. It was the kind of neighborhood where people looked out for each other without needing to be asked. And through all of it, Emily's mother remained the steady center of her world. She didn't talk much about her own past. Sometimes Emily wondered about it. Late at night, when homework was finished and the apartment had grown quiet, she would occasionally ask small questions. "What were you like when you were my age?" Her mother would smile slightly while washing dishes. "Oh, I had big dreams just like you." "What kind?" Her mother would pause for a moment, then answer in a gentle voice. "The kind that take time." It always felt like there was more behind that answer, but Amélie never pushed. Children trust the present more than they question the past. What Amélie did understand clearly was this: her mother believed in dignity, not the kind tied to money or status, but the kind rooted in how you treated people. If a neighbor needed help carrying groceries, you helped. If someone was having a difficult day, you listened. If life knocked you down, you stood back up and kept moving. Those quiet lessons shaped Amélie long before she realized it. By the time she reached her teenage years, people in the neighborhood had already noticed something about her. She smiled easily, not because life was easy, but because she understood that kindness could make hard days lighter. After school, she often volunteered at the local community center where younger kids gathered to finish homework or play basketball. Sometimes she helped them with reading. Other days, she simply listened while they talked about whatever was happening in their lives. The adults who ran the center often said the same thing about Amélie. That girl has patience. And patience, in a neighborhood where many families faced daily challenges, was a powerful gift. Still, Amélie never thought of herself as special. She simply followed the example she saw every day in her mother. Work hard, stay humble, treat people with respect, and trust that even small acts of care could ripple further than you ever expected. Those values became the quiet foundation of Amélie's life. She didn't know it yet, but they would also become the reason she survived the hardest moments that were still waiting ahead. Because strength doesn't always appear suddenly. Sometimes it begins in small apartments filled with music, in communities where people look out for each other, and in the steady love of a mother who teaches you how to stand tall long before the world tests your balance. And for 16 years, Amélie believed that steady rhythm of life would always continue. She had no way of knowing that one winter was about to change everything she understood about the future. The winter Amélie turned 16 arrived colder than usual in Atlanta. Cold enough that people pulled their coats tighter when stepping outside. Cold enough that the wind slipped through apartment windows that had never quite sealed properly. Inside their small home, though, life still carried its familiar rhythm. Music played softly in the evenings. Dinner simmered on the stove. Amélie finished homework at the kitchen table, while her mother moved quietly between the sink and the cabinets. At first, the changes were so small that Amélie barely noticed them. Her mother seemed more tired than usual. She would sit down more often after work. Sometimes she pressed a hand gently against her side as if trying to ease an ache she didn't want to talk about. "Long day?" Amélie asked one evening while closing her notebook. Her mother smiled, the same calm smile she always wore. "Just work," she replied. But the tiredness didn't go away. Weeks passed, and Amélie began noticing other small things. Meals became simpler. The music played less frequently. And sometimes her mother would sit quietly on the couch staring at nothing in particular, as if gathering strength for the next task. One afternoon after school, Amélie walked into the apartment and found her mother resting in the bedroom instead of cooking dinner. That had never happened before. Amélie stood in the doorway, uncertain. "You okay?" she asked softly. Her mother opened her eyes and smiled again, though the smile carried a little more effort now. "I'm all right, baby," she said gently. "Just need a little rest." Amélie nodded, but worry began growing quietly inside her chest. Soon, doctor visits started appearing on the calendar. Her mother tried to keep them casual, brushing them off as routine checkups. But Amélie could feel the difference in the air. Something serious was happening. Still, her mother kept moving forward the way she always had. She continued working. She continued asking about Amélie's grades. And every morning before school, she still found the strength to braid Amélie's hair. Those small moments meant more now. One evening near the end of January, Amélie sat beside her mother on the couch while snow fell lightly outside the window. Atlanta rarely saw snow, but that night the streets had turned quiet and white. Her mother watched the falling snow for a long time before speaking. "You're growing up fast," she said. Amélie laughed softly. "I'm still a kid." Her mother shook her head. "No, you're becoming something stronger than that." Amélie turned toward her, confused by the seriousness in her voice. "What do you mean?" Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "Life will ask a lot from you sometimes," she said quietly. "But I believe you're the kind of person who finds a way to keep going." Amélie frowned slightly. "Why are you talking like that?" Her mother didn't answer right away. She simply looked at her daughter with a kind of deep love that only appears when someone understands time is precious. Then she smiled again, just reminding you who you are. A few weeks later, the illness worsened. Her mother's strength faded quickly after that. There were no dramatic hospital scenes the way people often imagined. No long speeches filled with final advice. Everything happened quietly. One evening, the apartment felt heavier than usual. Neighbors stopped by with concerned faces. A nurse came and went. The house grew still in a way Amélie had never experienced before. And by the next morning, the woman who had built her entire world was gone. 16 years old. That was the age Amélie became responsible for her own future. Grief is a strange thing for someone so young. It doesn't arrive as constant tears the way adults expect. Sometimes it shows up in small moments. The empty chair at the dinner table. The silence where music once played. The absence of footsteps in the hallway. At the funeral, the church filled with people from their neighborhood. Women who had known her mother for years hugged Amélie tightly. Men from the community center shook her hand with quiet respect. Everyone said similar things. Your mother was proud of you. She raised a good young woman. You're not alone. And they meant it. The neighborhood truly did care for her. Neighbors brought food during the weeks that followed. Church members checked in often. Teachers at school gave her extra patience when assignments felt overwhelming. But even surrounded by support, Amélie felt the deep loneliness that comes when the person who raised you is suddenly no longer there. For a while, she moved through life on instinct alone. Wake up, go to school, finish homework, sleep, repeat. Yet something her mother once said continued echoing in her mind. Life will ask a lot from you sometimes. And slowly, Amélie began answering that challenge. She focused on school, studied harder than she ever had before. When graduation approached, she applied to a nearby community college because it was the most affordable option. At the same time, she started working. Her first job was at a small bookstore where she spent afternoons organizing shelves and recommending novels to customers. Later, she picked up weekend shifts serving brunch at a cafe downtown. 2 jobs, college classes, late nights studying. The schedule would have exhausted many people. But Amélie carried something powerful inside her now. Determination, not the loud kind that announces itself to the world. The quiet kind that simply refuses to give up. Every step she took during those years felt like building something piece by piece. Not just a career, a life. And even though the road ahead often felt uncertain, one thing remained clear in her mind. The lessons her mother had planted during those early years were still guiding her. Work hard, treat people with kindness, stand tall even when life becomes difficult. Those lessons became the foundation Amélie stood on as she entered adulthood. She didn't realize it yet, but the resilience she built during those difficult years would prepare her for a future far more complicated than she could possibly imagine. Because one ordinary evening, many years later, she would walk into a ballroom in downtown Atlanta and meet a man named Xavier. By the time Amélie turned 28, the difficult years behind her had shaped a life that felt steady. Not glamorous, not wealthy, but peaceful. She had finished college after transferring from community college to a university nearby. The road there had taken patience, long work hours, and plenty of late nights studying when most of her friends were sleeping. Still, she never regretted the effort. Her work now mattered deeply to her. Amélie had become a community outreach coordinator for a nonprofit organization that helped young girls find mentorship programs and educational opportunities. Many of the girls who walked through the office doors came from neighborhoods that looked a lot like the one she grew up in. Some were shy. Some carried anger from difficult home lives. Others simply needed someone who believed they could build something better. Amélie understood them. She had lived the same kind of challenges, and that connection made her good at her job. Her apartment reflected the quiet life she had built. It wasn't large, but every corner felt warm. A few houseplants sat by the windows. Books filled small shelves along the living room wall, and beside her bed stood a framed photo of her mother that she kept carefully polished. Most evenings followed a comfortable routine. Dinner at home, a book or documentary, occasionally meeting friends for coffee. It was the kind of life many people overlooked, but Amélie appreciated it. Peace had value. One Thursday evening, however, her routine shifted slightly. Her friend had been insisting for weeks that Amélie attend a charity event downtown. "You need to get out more," her friend had said more than once. "You spend all your time helping other people. Emily had laughed the first few times the suggestion came up. "I like my quiet life," she replied, but eventually she agreed. The event was held in one of the large hotel ballrooms in downtown Atlanta, the kind of place where polished floors reflected the glow of chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. When Emily arrived, she immediately noticed the difference between her world and the one filling the room. Men in tailored suits moved confidently through small circles of conversation. Women wore elegant dresses that looked like they had been chosen carefully for the evening. Servers passed through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling drinks. The atmosphere felt refined, a little intimidating. Emily smoothed the fabric of her deep blue dress as she stepped further inside. She had chosen it carefully that afternoon. The color complemented her dark skin beautifully, and the simple design gave her a quiet confidence even among the polished crowd. Still, she felt slightly out of place, not because she doubted herself, but because this world operated on different rules. Conversations often centered around investments, company expansions, and social connections that had existed for decades. Emily stood near one of the tall tables sipping a drink while listening politely to the discussion around her. Across the ballroom, Xavier noticed her almost immediately. He had attended many events like this throughout his life. For him, the environment felt normal. Xavier was 37, tall and composed, with a confident posture of someone who had spent years in boardrooms and high-level meetings. His tailored suit fit perfectly, and people greeted him frequently as he moved through the room. His family owned several successful investment firms that had operated for generations. Wealth had always been part of his life, yet wealth also came with a strange problem. Many of the conversations he encountered at these events followed predictable patterns. People were careful around him, too careful. They asked polite questions about business opportunities or mentioned connections that might benefit them later. Very few interactions felt genuine. That was why Emily caught his attention so quickly. She wasn't moving through the room trying to impress anyone. She simply stood near the edge of the crowd, observing the environment with calm curiosity. Her posture carried confidence, but there was no performance behind it, just authenticity. Xavier found himself watching her for a few moments longer than he expected. Then, almost without thinking about it, he walked across the room. Emily noticed him approaching when he stopped beside her table. "Good evening," he said politely. She looked up and met his eyes. "Evening." Her response was friendly but relaxed, as if she had no reason to feel nervous. Xavier appreciated that immediately. "Are you enjoying the event?" he asked. Emily considered the question honestly. "It's interesting," she said with a small smile. "Interesting. I'm still trying to figure out if everyone here actually enjoys talking about investment portfolios this much." The comment surprised him. For a moment, he simply laughed. "That's a fair observation." She tilted her head slightly. "So, what about you?" she asked. "What made you come tonight?" The question caught Xavier off guard. Most people at events like this already knew who he was before speaking to him. Their questions usually revolved around business or networking. But Emily hadn't asked his last name, hadn't asked what company he represented. She simply asked a genuine question. He answered honestly. "My business partner insisted I show up," he admitted. That made her laugh softly. "At least you're honest." The conversation continued from there. They spoke about music first. Emily mentioned the Motown records she grew up listening to with her mother. Xavier admitted he knew more about classical music because of the environment he was raised in. Then they talked about Atlanta, favorite restaurants, travel stories, family. Minutes turned into nearly an hour without either of them noticing. And for the first time in a long while, Xavier felt like he was having a conversation where no one expected anything from him. When the evening finally began winding down, he realized something unexpected. He didn't want the conversation to end. "Would you be open to meeting again sometime?" he asked. Emily paused slightly, not because she disliked him, but because she understood something about men who came from wealthy worlds. Sometimes they enjoyed meeting women like her at events. The novelty, the contrast, but real relationships required more than curiosity. Still, Xavier had spent an entire hour talking to her without once mentioning his status. That mattered, so she gave a small nod. "Yes," she said, and neither of them realized yet that this simple decision would eventually grow into a love story that changed both of their lives. After that evening in the ballroom, Xavier did something that surprised even himself. He called Emily the very next day. Most of his relationships in the past had followed a different rhythm. A few messages, a dinner somewhere expensive, conversations that often felt more like polite exchanges than real connection. But with Amélie, the memory of their conversations stayed with him long after the event ended. Her honesty, her calm confidence, the way she had spoken about music and community without trying to impress anyone. When she answered the phone, her voice carried the same relaxed tone he remembered. "Hello? Hi, it's Xavier," he said. There was a short pause. Then she laughed softly. "The charity event, that obvious?" "A little," she admitted. He asked if she would like to meet for coffee that weekend. Not dinner at an upscale restaurant. Not some formal evening that required planning. Just coffee. She agreed. Their first meeting outside the ballroom happened at a small neighborhood cafe that Amélie liked. It sat on a quiet street corner where regular customers greeted the staff by name. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, and sunlight filtered through large windows facing the sidewalk. When Xavier arrived, he noticed immediately that the environment felt completely different from the places he usually visited. People sat comfortably with laptops or books. A few families shared breakfast at small tables. Conversations were relaxed. Amélie was already there when he walked in. She sat near the window with a cup of tea and a notebook open beside her. "Good morning," he said as he approached. She looked up and smiled. "Morning." Their conversation picked up easily, almost like it had never paused after the charity event. They talked about work first. Amélie explained the mentorship programs she helped organize and the importance of giving young girls opportunities they might not otherwise have. Xavier listened carefully. "What made you choose that kind of work?" he asked. Amélie shrugged slightly. "I grew up around people who helped each other even when nobody had much," she said. It felt natural to continue that. He found that answer more interesting than most business discussions he attended. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes Xavier chose the restaurant. Other times, Amélie suggested places she liked around her neighborhood. One Saturday morning, she invited him to join her for a community event where several local teenagers were performing spoken-word poetry. The gathering took place inside a modest recreation center. Plastic chairs filled the room, and the small stage had a simple microphone set up in front of a curtain. Xavier sat beside Amélie while the teenagers stepped forward one by one to share their work. Some poems spoke about family struggles. Others talked about dreams of building better futures. When the event ended, Xavier looked around the room thoughtfully. "These kids are incredible," he said. Amélie nodded. "They just need someone to listen." Moments like that began changing the way Xavier saw parts of the city he had rarely visited before. His own upbringing had been very different. Private schools, exclusive clubs, formal dinners where adults discussed business while children learned how to navigate social expectations. But Amélie's world carried a different kind of richness. One Sunday morning, she invited him somewhere that mattered deeply to her. Church. Xavier had not attended church regularly since childhood, but he agreed. When they walked through the doors together, the atmosphere felt warm and lively. Music filled the room. People greeted each other like extended family. Several members of the congregation recognized Amélie immediately. They waved or stopped briefly to hug her before finding their seats. Xavier noticed something during the service. Amélie looked completely at home there, not performing, not trying to fit in, just existing naturally among people who clearly respected her. Afterward, as they walked toward the parking lot, he said something quietly. "You belong here." She glanced at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people trust you," he explained. "You can feel it." Amélie smiled gently. "That's what community does." Over time, Xavier continued showing up in her world. He joined her for small neighborhood gatherings, walked through local markets on Saturday afternoons, sat with her in cafes where the staff began recognizing him. And slowly, something inside him changed. At first, his curiosity about her life had simply been interest. Now, it had become affection. Real affection. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street after dinner, Xavier looked over at her thoughtfully. "You know something?" he said. "What?" "I don't think I've ever laughed this much during a relationship." Amélie raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a strange compliment." "It's the truth," he replied. She studied him for a moment before answering. "Just make sure you're not enjoying the idea of my world more than the reality of it." He stopped walking. "I'm serious about you," he said. Her eyes searched his face carefully. Emily had seen enough of life to know that charm and sincerity were not always the same thing. Still, Xavier kept showing up, not occasionally, consistently. Weeks turned into months. Friends in her community began noticing how often he appeared beside her at events. Some even teased her gently about it. "You two look serious," someone said one afternoon. Emily didn't answer right away, because trusting someone with your heart is never a quick decision. But slowly, as time passed, she began allowing herself to believe something. Maybe Xavier wasn't just visiting her world. Maybe he was choosing to be part of it, and that belief quietly opened the door for something deeper between them. Time has a quiet way of revealing whether a relationship is built on curiosity or commitment. For Emily and Xavier, the months that followed their first meetings slowly answered that question. Xavier didn't disappear after the early excitement faded. He didn't drift away once the novelty of her world wore off. Instead, he kept showing up, not only for dinners or weekend outings, but for the everyday pieces of life that most people overlook. Sometimes he met her after work just to walk through the neighborhood while the sun set over the city. Other evenings they sat in her small living room listening to music from the old records she still collected. Motown remained her favorite. One night while a record played softly in the background, Xavier leaned back against the couch and listened carefully to the lyrics. "You really grew up with this music, didn't you?" he asked. Emily smiled. "My mother loved it," she said. "She used to play records while cooking dinner." He nodded, thoughtfully. "It feels different hearing it this way." "How?" "Less like entertainment," he said. "More like memory." Moments like that deepened their connection. They spoke openly about the past, about ambitions, and about the different paths that had shaped them. Xavier shared stories about growing up surrounded by business expectations and formal traditions. Emily talked about the small neighborhood that had raised her and the lessons her mother had quietly passed down. Their lives had started in completely different environments, but somehow their conversations always found common ground. A year into the relationship, the people around them began noticing the change. Emily's friends no longer saw Xavier as the businessman who occasionally appeared at community events. They saw him as someone who had become part of her routine, someone who sat beside her at church, someone who helped set up chairs during youth programs, someone who stayed long after events ended, laughing with people who had once been strangers to him. Xavier's own world noticed the shift too. He attended fewer social gatherings with business associates. Instead, he spent most of his time where Emily felt comfortable. One evening during a quiet dinner together, Xavier asked a question that carried a deeper meaning. "Have you ever thought about getting married?" Emily looked up slowly. "Someday," she said. He nodded. "What does that look like for you?" She considered the question carefully. "I don't need something big or dramatic," she replied. "Just honesty, loyalty, someone who shows up when life becomes difficult." Xavier listened closely to every word. That conversation stayed in his mind for weeks. Then, one Friday afternoon, he surprised her with an idea. "Pack a bag," he said during a phone call. "For what?" "A short trip," he answered. "Where?" "You'll see." Emily laughed. "You know I don't usually agree to mysterious plans. Trust me this once." After a brief pause, she said yes. The next morning they drove several hours until the busy streets of Atlanta slowly gave way to the open coastline. By late afternoon they arrived at a quiet beach town where the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air smelled of salt and sea breeze. Waves rolled gently toward the sand. They spent the evening walking along the shoreline while the sky slowly changed colors as the sun lowered toward the water. Emily removed her shoes and let the cool sand press between her toes. "This place is beautiful," she said. Xavier watched her for a moment before speaking. "I used to come here when I needed to think. About business? About life." They continued walking until the beach grew quieter. The sun hovered low above the ocean now, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. Emily turned toward the water, watching the waves. Behind her, Xavier stopped walking. He took a breath that felt heavier than he expected. "Emily," he said. She turned around and noticed something unusual immediately. Xavier looked nervous, not uncertain, just deeply serious. "What's wrong?" she asked. Instead of answering right away, he reached for her hands. The wind moved gently through her hair as she studied his face. Then he spoke. "I've spent most of my life around people who measured success with numbers," he said quietly. Investments, profits, expansion. She listened carefully. But meeting you changed the way I think about what actually matters. Her eyes softened slightly. Xavier took another breath. I don't want a life that feels empty, even when everything looks successful from the outside. He looked directly at her. I want a life with you. Then he slowly lowered himself onto one knee. For a moment, Emily simply stared at him, completely caught off guard. Xavier reached into his pocket and revealed a small ring. No photographers, no audience, just the sound of waves moving across the sand. Emily, he said, his voice steady but emotional, will you marry me? Silence filled the space between them for several seconds. Her hands moved slowly to her mouth as she processed what was happening. You're serious, she whispered, completely. Tears formed in her eyes before she could stop them, not because the moment was overwhelming, but because it felt sincere, carefully chosen, exactly the kind of proposal she had once described. Finally she nodded. Yes, she said softly. Relief and joy spread across Xavier's face as he placed the ring on her finger. They stood there for a long moment afterward, holding each other while the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. That weekend marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Their wedding took place months later in Atlanta. The ceremony blended both of their worlds. Friends from Emily's community filled the church with warmth and laughter. Xavier's family attended with polite smiles and formal greetings. They were respectful, but distant. His mother, in particular, carried the quiet expression of someone who had expected her son to choose a partner from a different social circle. Still, Xavier didn't seem concerned. He held Emily's hand throughout the ceremony with complete certainty, and when they exchanged vows, his voice carried the confidence of a man who believed he had made the right decision. For a while, it truly felt that way. Marriage brought new experiences into Emily's life. A larger home in a quiet suburb outside the city. Formal dinners with people who discussed business strategies and international investments. Rooms filled with artwork and furniture that looked far more expensive than anything she had ever owned. At first, the adjustment felt strange. But Xavier always reassured her. You belong here, he would say. And slowly, Emily began believing that maybe their two worlds could truly exist together. For the first year of marriage, the future looked promising. They talked about traveling together, about building a family, about the kind of home they wanted to create. Neither of them realized yet that life was already preparing to test the promises they had made beside the ocean. The first year of marriage passed with the kind of quiet happiness many couples hope for. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming, just the steady rhythm of two people learning how to build a life together. The house Xavier and Emily bought sat in a peaceful suburb just outside Atlanta. Tree-lined streets curved through the neighborhood, and most evenings ended with neighbors walking their dogs while the sun slowly disappeared behind the rooftops. Inside the house, Emily worked carefully to make the space feel like home. She placed houseplants near the windows, filled bookshelves with novels she loved, and kept the framed photo of her mother beside their bed the same way she had in her old apartment. Some nights Xavier returned from work carrying takeout containers from restaurants he liked downtown. Other evenings they cooked together, or at least attempted to. One night, Xavier stood at the stove trying to follow a recipe on his phone while Emily watched from the counter. You're doing that wrong, she said. He frowned. It says medium heat. You're cooking it like you're negotiating a business deal. What does that even mean? It means you're overthinking scrambled eggs. He laughed and handed her the spatula. Fine, you take over. Small moments like that filled their days. And gradually, the idea of expanding their family began appearing in conversations. Sometimes it happened casually. A comment while watching a movie. A joke about what their future children might inherit from each of them. Other times, the conversation became more serious. One evening, while sitting on the back patio, Xavier leaned against the railing and asked quietly, "Do you think you'd want kids soon?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She watched the sky for a moment while thinking. "Yes," she said finally, "I do." His expression softened. "So do I." The opportunity came sooner than either of them expected. One morning several months later, Emily woke earlier than usual. The house was still quiet. Xavier had already left for a breakfast meeting, and the sunlight creeping through the bedroom window carried the soft glow of early morning. Emily sat on the edge of the bed holding a small pregnancy test in her hand. 2 lines. She stared at it for several seconds, blinking as if the result might change if she looked long enough. Then, A slow smile spread across her face. Her hands trembled slightly as the realization settled in. She stood and walked into the bathroom mirror, placing one hand gently over her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered to her reflection. When Xavier returned home later that evening, he found Amélie waiting in the kitchen. Her expression looked different, bright, excited. "What's going on?" he asked while setting his keys down. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked toward him slowly and placed the test into his hand. At first, he looked confused. Then his eyes widened as the meaning became clear. "You're serious?" he asked. Amélie nodded. "We're having a baby." For a moment, Xavier simply stared at her. Then a wide smile broke across his face as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "This is incredible," he said. She laughed through happy tears. "I know." The weeks that followed felt full of possibility. Doctor appointments filled the calendar. Amélie began reading books about pregnancy and child development. Xavier started talking about turning one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery. They visited furniture stores on weekends, looking at cribs, rocking chairs, and tiny clothes that somehow made the idea of parenthood feel more real. During one appointment at the doctor's office, Xavier sat beside Amélie holding her hand, while the technician prepared the ultrasound screen. When the first faint image of their baby appeared, he leaned forward with amazement. "That's really our child?" he asked quietly. Amélie squeezed his hand. "Yes." Moments like that deepened their excitement. They talked often about the future, about teaching their child kindness, about building a family where love felt safe and dependable. But somewhere beneath that happiness, small changes began appearing. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Xavier's work schedule started growing heavier. Business meetings stretched later into the evening. Occasionally, he returned home after Amélie had already gone to bed. At first, she didn't question it. His career had always demanded long hours, and she trusted him. Still, the pattern continued. Phone calls he stepped outside to answer, dinner plans that changed at the last minute, conversations where his attention seemed slightly elsewhere. One evening while they were eating dinner together, Amélie noticed he kept checking his phone between bites. "Everything okay at work?" she asked. He looked up quickly. "Yeah. Just some investment issues." She nodded, but the explanation felt incomplete. Another night, he arrived home past midnight. When Amélie asked how the meeting went, he gave a short answer and changed the subject. None of it seemed dramatic on its own, just small shifts in behavior. Still, Amélie felt a quiet unease beginning to grow. Not suspicion, just the subtle awareness that something about their rhythm had changed. One evening, she stood alone in the nursery room that Xavier had started preparing. Soft yellow paint covered the walls. A crib sat near the window waiting to be assembled. She placed her hand over her stomach as the baby moved gently. "You're going to have a beautiful life," she whispered. And in that moment, Amélie truly believed the family they were building would remain strong. What she didn't realize yet was that while she dreamed about the future growing inside her, Xavier's choices were already beginning to move their lives toward a very different direction, one that would soon test everything they thought they understood about love, loyalty, and commitment. Spring arrived gently that year in Atlanta. The cold from winter had faded, leaving behind warm afternoons and soft evening breezes that moved through the trees lining the quiet streets of Amélie and Xavier's neighborhood. Dogwood blossoms appeared along sidewalks. Families decorated their front porches with pastel wreaths as Easter weekend approached. Inside the house Amélie shared with Xavier, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and freshly baked sweet bread. Cooking had always been one of the ways she relaxed. That afternoon she had spent hours preparing food for the upcoming holiday. A small cake cooled near the window, while another dish simmered slowly on the stove. Music played softly from her phone on the counter. Old gospel songs, the kind her mother used to play during holidays when Amélie was growing up. She moved carefully around the kitchen, one hand occasionally resting against the gentle curve of her stomach. 6 months pregnant now. Her belly had grown noticeably round, and the baby had begun kicking more frequently over the past few weeks. As if responding to the smell of food filling the room, Amélie laughed quietly when she felt another small movement. "All right," she said softly while stirring the pot. "I know you're excited too." The house felt peaceful, but also unusually quiet. Xavier had been coming home later and later recently. At first she told herself not to read too much into it. His business often required long meetings, investors, clients from out of town. Those kinds of responsibilities had always been part of his career. Still, the pattern had grown more frequent. Tonight was no different. Emily glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 7:38 p.m. Dinner had been ready nearly 20 minutes earlier. She reached for her phone, thinking about sending him a quick message. Just as she unlocked the screen, headlights swept across the kitchen wall through the front window. A car had pulled into the driveway. Relief settled gently in her chest. Finally, she murmured. She set the phone down and straightened the tablecloth slightly before walking toward the doorway, connecting the kitchen and hallway. The front door opened. Footsteps entered the house. Normally, Xavier would call out when he arrived. A casual greeting, something like, "Hey, Em." But tonight the house remained silent. Emily frowned slightly. The footsteps moved slowly down the hallway before stopping near the kitchen entrance. When Xavier stepped into the room, something immediately felt different. He still wore the dark coat from work. His tie had loosened slightly around his collar, and his hands stayed buried deep inside his pockets. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled her. It was the expression on his face. He looked distant, not angry, not tired, just removed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily forced a small smile. "You made it before everything got cold," she said lightly. Xavier didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood near the doorway, glancing briefly around the room before looking down at the floor. The silence stretched longer than expected. Emily felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. "Xavier?" she asked gently. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled. His voice came out quieter than usual. "We need to talk." 3 words. Simple, yet something about the way he said them made the room feel suddenly heavier. Emily's smile faded. Most people learn over time that those words rarely lead to good news. Still, she kept her voice calm. "Okay," she said. She pulled out one of the chairs at the dining table. "Let's sit." But Xavier didn't move toward the table. He remained standing where he was, his shoulders stiff and his gaze fixed somewhere near the floor. That small decision made Emily uneasy. "Xavier," she said again, her tone slightly more serious now. He looked up finally, and for the first time that evening, their eyes met. Whatever she saw in his expression made her heart beat faster. Not because he looked angry, but because he looked like someone preparing to deliver news he had already accepted. News that could not be taken back once spoken. Emily's hand moved slowly over her stomach again. The baby shifted gently beneath her palm. For a moment the kitchen felt very small. The sound of the simmering pot on the stove suddenly seemed louder than before. Outside, a car passed quietly down the street. But inside the house, everything had grown still. Xavier took one more breath, and Emily realized something she could not explain yet. The life she had been building with him for the past several years was about to change. She simply didn't know how. Not yet. The silence inside the kitchen stretched longer than either of them expected. Emily remained standing near the table, one hand resting against the small of her back while the other stayed protectively over her stomach. The baby shifted again beneath her palm, a gentle reminder of the life growing inside her. Across the room, Xavier still hadn't moved from the doorway. The space between them suddenly felt much larger than a few steps of tile floor. "You said we need to talk," Emily said quietly. Her voice stayed steady, though something in her chest had begun tightening with every passing second. Xavier finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was hesitation there, but not uncertainty. More like someone preparing to deliver a decision already made. "I've been thinking about things for a while," he began. The way he said it made Emily's stomach twist slightly. "Thinking about what?" she asked. Xavier rubbed the back of his neck, a habit she had noticed whenever he felt uncomfortable during difficult conversations. "This marriage," he said slowly. The words seemed to hover in the air between them. Emily frowned. "What about it?" Another pause. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. "I'm not happy anymore." For a moment she simply stared at him. The sentence didn't seem to connect with the life she thought they were living. "What do you mean you're not happy?" she asked. He looked away briefly before answering. "I mean, things haven't felt right for a long time." Emily blinked, trying to process the statement. "Xavier, we're expecting a baby in 3 months," she said carefully. "I know, and we've been planning the nursery together." "I know." Each response came out calm, almost detached. That calmness unsettled her more than anger would have. "Then what exactly are you saying?" she asked, Xavier took a slow breath. "I think we rushed into this marriage," he said. The sentence hit her like a sudden gust of wind. "Rushed," she repeated. Her voice rose slightly. "We dated for 2 years. I know. We got married after that. I know. And now I'm carrying your child." Again, he said the same 2 words. "I know." The repetition felt like a wall she couldn't break through. Emily stepped closer to him. "So, explain it to me," she said. "What changed?" Xavier hesitated. Not long, but long enough that Emily felt dread beginning to settle deeper in her chest. "There's someone else," he said. The words landed quietly, but their impact felt enormous. Emily didn't move, didn't speak. Her mind struggled to catch up with what she had just heard. "Someone else," she repeated softly. Xavier nodded once. The baby shifted again beneath her hand. Suddenly, Emily felt the need to sit down. She pulled out the nearest chair and lowered herself into it slowly, her breathing becoming shallow. "You're telling me," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "that while I'm 6 months pregnant with your child, you've been seeing another woman?" Xavier didn't answer immediately, but his silence confirmed everything. "How long?" Emily asked. "Several months." Several months. The words echoed in her head. That meant the affair had started while she was already pregnant, while they had been attending doctor appointments, while they had been discussing baby names. Her chest tightened painfully. "You were coming home from meetings," she said slowly. "Phone calls outside, late nights." Each sentence felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Xavier shifted his weight slightly. "I didn't plan for it to happen," he said. Emily looked up sharply. "You didn't plan it?" "No." "Then how exactly does someone accidentally start an affair?" He didn't respond. The quiet stretched again. Finally, she asked the question she had been avoiding. "Who is she?" Xavier's jaw tightened slightly before answering. "She's someone who understands my world better." Emily's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "She comes from the same social circles I do," he explained. "The same environment." The explanation landed harder than he probably intended, because Emily understood what he was really saying. This woman belonged to the wealthy world Xavier had grown up in, a world that had never fully embraced Emily. "So she fits better," Emily said quietly. Xavier didn't correct her. Instead, he nodded. "Things are easier with her." Easier. The word felt like a knife sliding into something already wounded. Emily leaned back in the chair slowly. For several seconds she simply studied the man standing in front of her. The man who had once knelt on a beach asking her to marry him. The man who had promised to build a future together. And now that same man stood calmly explaining why another woman made life easier. "You're leaving me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Xavier answered. The room grew very still. Emily placed both hands over her stomach now, almost instinctively protecting the child inside her. "And your daughter?" she asked. His eyes flickered briefly toward her belly. "I'll take care of financial responsibilities," he replied. The answer sounded more like something discussed during a business negotiation than a family conversation. Emily felt something inside her chest shift at that moment. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Clarity. "So let me understand this correctly," she said calmly. "You're divorcing your pregnant wife during Easter weekend because another woman fits better into your social circle." Xavier sighed slightly. "I didn't plan the timing." "No," Emily replied softly. "You just planned everything else." He looked like he wanted to say something more, maybe to soften the situation, maybe to explain himself further. But the truth had already been spoken, and there was no way to take it back now. The kitchen remained silent except for the soft bubbling sound from the pot still simmering on the stove. The dinner she had prepared for the two of them sat untouched on the table, and Emily realized something with painful certainty. The life she thought they were building together had already been abandoned long before this conversation began. She just hadn't known it yet. The quiet inside the kitchen felt heavier after Xavier finished speaking. Emily remained seated at the table, both hands resting gently over her stomach. The baby moved again beneath her palms, a small kick that reminded her she wasn't facing this moment entirely alone. Across the room, Xavier shifted his weight slightly. He looked uncomfortable now, not because he was reconsidering what he had said, but because the reality of saying it out loud had finally settled in the room between them. Emily inhaled slowly, letting the breath steady her thoughts. For several seconds she didn't speak. Then she asked a question in a calm voice that surprised even herself. "When were you going to tell me?" Xavier glanced briefly toward the counter before answering. "Tonight." She nodded faintly. "And why tonight?" Another pause. Then he answered honestly. She wanted things settled. The sentence landed quietly, but the meaning behind it was clear. The other woman had reached a point where she expected a decision. Emily let out a small breath. "Of course she did," she said. She pushed her chair back and stood carefully, adjusting the weight of her body as she moved. Pregnancy had made certain movements slower now, but she kept her posture steady. Xavier reached into the inside pocket of his coat. For a moment, Emily wondered what he was about to take out. Then he placed a thick envelope on the table. "Divorce papers," he said. The words felt oddly formal, as if he were discussing documents during a business meeting rather than ending a marriage. Emily stared at the envelope. The sight of it made something inside her chest ache in a way that felt deeper than anger. This had been planned, prepared, while she had been buying baby clothes and reading parenting books. She walked slowly toward the table and picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavier than expected. Her fingers lingered along the edge before she placed it back down. "I'll have a lawyer review them," she said. Xavier nodded. "Of course." Silence filled the room again. For a brief moment, Xavier looked like he wanted to say something else. Maybe an apology. Maybe an explanation that might soften the situation. But nothing came. Emily turned toward the window above the sink. Outside, the streetlights had turned on. A few houses down the block, she could see a family sitting together at their dining table through the front window. Ordinary life continuing. Children laughing. Plates being passed across the table. The contrast felt almost surreal. Behind her, Xavier cleared his throat slightly. "Emily." She didn't turn around. Instead, she spoke quietly. "You should go." The words caught him off guard. "What?" "You said you have somewhere else to be," she replied calmly. Her tone carried no bitterness, just acceptance. Xavier hesitated. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then go." He stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for some kind of emotional reaction. Tears, anger, a plea for him to reconsider. But Emily didn't give him any of those things. She remained still, looking out the window, one hand resting over the life growing inside her. Finally, Xavier walked toward the front door. His footsteps echoed softly through the hallway. Just before leaving, he stopped. "Emily," he said again. This time she turned slightly. He looked at her with an expression that carried something close to regret. "I hope someday you understand," he said quietly. Emily studied him for a moment. Then she answered in a voice that was steady and clear. "I already understand." He waited, and she added one final sentence. "You showed me exactly who you are." The truth in her words left no space for argument. Xavier lowered his eyes briefly. Then he opened the door. Cool, evening air drifted inside as he stepped out. A second later, the door closed. The sound echoed through the house. And just like that, the life Emily had known for the past several years ended. The silence that followed felt enormous. For a moment she simply stood there, listening to the quiet. Then slowly she walked back toward the table and lowered herself into the chair again. The envelope containing the divorce papers remained exactly where Xavier had left it. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she placed both hands over her stomach. The baby kicked again. A small, reassuring movement. Tears finally filled her eyes. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks. "It's okay," she whispered softly. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the baby or to herself. "It's going to be okay." The house felt different now, emptier, but in the middle of that emptiness, Emily felt something else forming, something unexpected. Strength, because sometimes the worst night of your life becomes the moment you stop depending on someone who was never strong enough to stay. And as Emily sat quietly in the kitchen, one hand resting over her unborn child, she realized something that would guide the rest of her life. She might have lost a husband that night, but she had not lost herself. The house felt different after Xavier left, not because anything inside it had changed. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. The same polished kitchen counters reflected the morning sunlight. The nursery room upstairs still held the crib Xavier had started assembling weeks earlier, yet something essential had disappeared. Absence has a way of reshaping a place. For the first few days after the conversation on Easter Eve, Amélie moved through the house slowly. She woke early most mornings, often before the sun had fully risen. Sleep came in short stretches now. Sometimes she lay awake listening to the quiet of the empty rooms, replaying the last conversation she and Xavier had shared in the kitchen. But the strange thing was this: the more time passed, the less anger she felt. Pain remained, of course. Betrayal always leaves its mark. But beneath that pain, something else was forming. Clarity. The marriage had not ended in that kitchen. It had ended months earlier, during the moment Xavier chose someone else while still coming home to her. Understanding that truth helped Amélie face the practical decisions waiting ahead. One morning she walked slowly through the house with a notebook in her hand. She stood in each room for a few moments. The living room where they once watched movies, the back patio where they had talked about having children, the nursery with its soft yellow walls. Every space held memories, but none of them felt like home anymore. Amélie closed the notebook. The decision had already formed in her mind. She would leave the house, not out of anger, but because beginning a new chapter required a different space. The process of packing began the following week. Pregnancy made certain tasks slower than usual, yet Amélie worked steadily each day. She started with the bedroom. Clothes folded carefully into boxes, books wrapped in soft paper, the framed photo of her mother placed gently on top of everything else. That photo never stayed far from her. As the days passed, the house gradually emptied. Each sealed box felt like closing a small chapter of the life she once imagined. Occasionally, Amélie paused to rest when the baby kicked strongly. Those moments always made her smile. "You're keeping me busy already," she murmured once while sitting on the edge of the bed. But the baby's movements also reminded her why she kept going. She wasn't just rebuilding for herself anymore. She was preparing a life for her child. After 2 weeks of careful planning, Amélie signed a lease for a modest townhouse closer to the neighborhood where she had grown up. The area felt familiar. Tree-lined sidewalks, local cafes where people greeted each other easily, small parks where children played during the afternoons. It wasn't luxury, but it felt alive. The day she moved, several people from her community showed up without needing to be asked. Boxes were carried inside, furniture arranged carefully. Someone brought homemade food that filled the kitchen with comforting smells. By evening, the townhouse had already begun feeling warm. Amélie stood in the living room looking around at the newly arranged space. The couch faced the window. Her books filled the small shelves along one wall, and the photo of her mother now rested on a table beside the sofa. She placed one hand gently over her stomach. The baby moved again. "We're going to be okay," she whispered softly. Over the next few weeks, Amélie focused on building a new routine. Doctor appointments continued as expected. She organized the baby's room inside the townhouse. Soft blankets, tiny clothes, a rocking chair placed near the window. Sometimes she paused there in the evenings, rocking slowly while imagining the future. Life had not turned out the way she once imagined, but something inside her remained steady. She still believed in the values her mother had taught her. Kindness, responsibility, dignity. Those principles had carried her through difficult years before. They would guide her again now. And as Amélie sat quietly in the small rocking chair one evening, feeling the gentle movement of the child inside her, she realized something important. Starting over was not the same thing as losing. Sometimes it was simply the first step toward discovering a life stronger than the one that ended. What she didn't know yet was that the past she thought she understood was about to reveal a secret her mother had protected for years. A secret that would change everything. 3 weeks after moving into the townhouse, Amélie had finally settled into a new rhythm. The early days in the new place had been filled with unpacking, organizing, and adjusting to the quiet independence of living alone again. But gradually, the space began to feel familiar. Each morning started the same way. Sunlight entered through the large living room window, warming the wooden floors while Amélie prepared breakfast in the kitchen. After eating, she often sat at the small dining table reviewing paperwork related to the divorce. Financial documents, insurance forms, legal notices that seemed written in language designed to confuse anyone who wasn't trained to read them. Handling those responsibilities while pregnant was exhausting, but Amélie approached each task carefully. Avoiding problems would only create bigger ones later. That morning she sat at the table with several documents spread out in front of her. A cup of tea rested beside the papers. Outside, the neighborhood had already come alive. Cars passed along the street, and children's voices echoed faintly from a nearby park. Emily reached for one of the envelopes when her phone suddenly rang. The number on the screen wasn't familiar. For a moment she considered letting the call go to voicemail. Most unknown numbers recently had been telemarketers or automated systems. But something made her answer. Hello? A calm male voice spoke on the other end. Good morning. May I speak with Emily? This is she. There was a brief pause. Miss Emily, I'm calling from a legal office regarding your mother. The words immediately caught her attention. My mother? She repeated. Yes. Emily sat up slightly in the chair. My mother passed away years ago. Yes, the voice replied gently. We're aware of that. The calm tone unsettled her slightly. This matter concerns an estate that has recently been finalized. For a moment, Emily assumed there must be some mistake. My mother didn't have an estate, she said. Her memory of those years remained clear. They had struggled financially during parts of her childhood. There had been no houses, no investments, no family wealth waiting to be distributed. I understand why that might seem confusing, the voice said. That's why we'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Emily felt her heart begin to beat a little faster. What exactly is this about? We believe it would be best if you came into our office so we can explain everything properly. The calm certainty in his voice made it clear this was not a misunderstanding. Still, the idea seemed impossible. What kind of estate are we talking about? She asked. Your mother's estate, he replied. There are documents that require your review. Emily remained silent for several seconds. Her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. The man on the phone continued speaking in a patient tone. Would you be available to visit our office this afternoon? Emily looked down at the papers scattered across the table. Divorce forms, insurance documents, a future she had been trying to rebuild piece by piece. Now suddenly another piece of the past had appeared without warning. Yes, she said finally. I can come in. The office address was located downtown. After the call ended, Emily sat quietly at the table for a moment. Her fingers rested lightly on the phone while her thoughts raced. Why would a legal office contact her about her mother so many years after her passing? Nothing about it made sense. Still, curiosity slowly replaced confusion. By early afternoon, Emily arrived at the office building. The structure stood among several tall buildings in the business district. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. She checked in at the reception desk and was guided toward a conference room. The room itself felt quiet and professional. A long wooden table occupied the center, while tall windows overlooked the city streets below. Two individuals were already seated at the table waiting. They greeted Emily politely as she entered. Thank you for coming, one of them said. Emily took a seat across from them. I'm still trying to understand why I'm here, she admitted. The person across the table opened a folder. Before we begin, he said carefully, I need to confirm something with you. Okay. Your mother's name was Angela Brooks, correct? Emily nodded slowly. Yes. The two individuals exchanged a brief glance before returning their attention to her. Then the man folded his hands and spoke the sentence that changed everything. Miss Emily, your mother left behind an estate valued at approximately $50 million. For a moment the words didn't register. Emily blinked, certain she had misunderstood. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Did you say 50 million? Yes. The room felt suddenly very still. Her mind struggled to connect that number with the woman she remembered. My mother worked long hours just to pay rent sometimes, Emily said slowly. The man across from her nodded gently. We understand why this is surprising. Then he said something that made the moment even more unbelievable. The life you saw growing up was not the full picture. Emily felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she knew about her past. And in that moment, she realized something extraordinary. Her mother had been living a life Emily had never known existed. For several seconds after hearing the number, Emily could not respond. $50 million. The figure hung in the air inside the conference room, too large for her mind to grasp immediately. She sat very still in the chair, staring at the folder resting on the table in front of her. Her mother, the woman who had worked long hours, the woman who had braided her hair before school every morning, the woman who had sometimes come home exhausted after double shifts. Nothing about that life had ever suggested hidden wealth. "I think there must be some mistake," Emily said finally. Her voice sounded distant even to herself. The person sitting across from her gently opened the folder. "There is no mistake," he said. Inside the folder were several documents arranged neatly in clear protective sleeves. He slid the first page across the table. "This is a copy of your mother's ownership agreement." Emily looked down. The document listed her mother's name clearly. Angela Brooks. Below the name were several lines describing corporate ownership shares in a company she had never heard of before. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. "Technology logistics firm," she read quietly. "Yes," the man confirmed. The company was established nearly 25 years ago and expanded rapidly during the last decade. Emily's mind struggled to follow the explanation. "My mother never mentioned anything about running a company," she said. "That was intentional," the man replied. He turned to another page inside the folder. Several financial statements followed. Growth reports, corporate expansion records, numbers that climbed higher every year. By the time Emily reached the most recent document, the valuation of the company was staggering. How could she hide something like this? Emily whispered. The man folded his hands calmly. "Your mother structured her business operations through several layers of management," he explained. "She rarely appeared publicly as the primary owner." "But why?" Emily asked. "Why keep something like this secret from her own daughter?" For the first time since the meeting began, the answer came with a hint of emotion. According to the documents she left behind, she believed it was necessary. He turned another page in the folder. This time it contained a photograph. The image showed a modern office building with the company's name displayed across the front entrance. Standing near the building was a woman wearing a professional suit, her hair styled neatly, her posture confident. Emily froze the moment she saw the face. It was her mother, older than she remembered, but unmistakably the same person. The date printed on the bottom corner of the photograph was from 6 years earlier. 6 years. Emily leaned back slowly in the chair. Her mother had not simply been surviving financially. She had been building something enormous, all while allowing Emily to believe they lived a modest life. "I don't understand," Emily said quietly. "She never told me any of this." The man nodded. "There are additional instructions in the estate documents that explain her reasoning." He reached into the folder again and removed a sealed letter. "This was written by your mother personally." Emily stared at the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly as she accepted it. The handwriting across the front immediately felt familiar. The same gentle style she remembered from birthday cards and school notes during childhood. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short, but every word carried meaning. "Your life needed to grow free from the pressure that money brings. I wanted you to build your character before discovering the wealth waiting for you." Emily felt tears begin forming in her eyes. The letter continued. "If you are reading this, it means the legal process protecting the company is complete. Everything I built now belongs to you. Use it wisely, and never forget the values that shaped you." Emily lowered the letter slowly. For the first time since entering the building, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks. The woman she had believed struggled financially had actually been protecting her future all along. Protecting her childhood from the expectations that wealth often brings. "You said the estate is worth 50 million?" Emily asked softly. "Yes," the man confirmed. "That includes ownership shares, property assets, and financial investments." The number sounded unreal even now. But strangely, the first emotion she felt was not excitement. It was gratitude. Her mother had spent years building something powerful, not to show off success, not to gain attention, but to create security for her daughter. Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then she placed one hand gently over her stomach. The baby moved again beneath her palm. For the first time since the painful night Xavier walked out of their home, something new appeared inside her chest. Hope, not because of the money itself, but because the woman who had raised her had been protecting her future in ways she never understood. And now that future had arrived at exactly the moment she needed it most. The discovery of her mother's inheritance changed many things in Emily's life, but it did not change who she was. For the first few days after leaving the legal office, she carried the information quietly in her mind while continuing her normal routine. She still woke early, still prepared breakfast in the small kitchen of the townhouse, still attended her doctor appointments as her pregnancy moved steadily toward its final months. The number itself felt unreal. $50 million. Most people would have reacted immediately. Luxury homes, new cars, travel, a completely different lifestyle. But Amélie approached the situation the same way she had handled every difficult moment in her life. Slowly, carefully. The first thing she did was return to the legal office a few days later to review the documents in detail. Company records filled several folders. Financial reports, ownership agreements, investment portfolios that had grown steadily over the years. The scale of what her mother had built amazed her. Yet the more Amélie studied the information, the more she realized something important. The wealth represented opportunity, not identity. Money could change circumstances, but it did not need to change her character. That realization guided every decision she made next. One of the first choices she confirmed surprised the legal advisors handling the estate. Amélie decided to keep working at the nonprofit organization. When she arrived at the office that week, the building looked exactly the same as it always had. Teenagers gathered near the entrance talking loudly before their mentoring sessions began. Inside, the small office buzzed with its usual mix of paperwork, conversations, and planning for upcoming programs. Amélie sat at her desk reviewing schedules for the next mentorship workshop. Across the room, several young girls laughed while discussing their school projects. Moments like that reminded her why she had chosen this career in the first place. The work mattered. It had nothing to do with money. Helping young people discover opportunities was something she had believed in long before learning about her inheritance. That purpose didn't disappear simply because her financial situation had changed. Over the following weeks, Amélie quietly used part of the estate to strengthen programs that already existed. Additional scholarships were funded. More resources were provided for mentorship groups. Educational materials were purchased for community centers in neighborhoods similar to the one where she had grown up. None of it carried her name publicly. She preferred it that way. Her mother had built her company without seeking attention. Amélie respected that example. At the same time, she focused on preparing for the child who would soon enter her life. Financial planners created a trust fund for the baby. Education, healthcare, and future security were carefully organized. Not extravagant spending, just responsible planning. One evening, Amélie sat in the rocking chair inside the small nursery room she had prepared in the townhouse. Soft yellow walls reflected the warm glow of a small lamp near the window. Tiny clothes rested neatly inside a dresser beside the crib. She placed both hands over her stomach as the baby moved again. The kicks had grown stronger in recent weeks, almost like the child already carried determination. "You're going to have choices I never had," Amélie whispered softly. The thought didn't fill her with pride. It filled her with responsibility. Her mother had spent decades building something powerful, not to impress the world, but to create security for her daughter. Now Amélie carried that same responsibility forward. Later that night, she sat at the small dining table reviewing one final document from the estate. Ownership shares of the company now belonged entirely to her. She closed the folder slowly. The future ahead of her had expanded far beyond what she once imagined. But strangely, the most important part of that future had nothing to do with the company or the money. It had everything to do with the child who would soon arrive. Because wealth might shape opportunities, but character would shape the life that child would grow up seeing every day. And as Amélie turned off the lights in the townhouse that evening, one thought remained clear in her mind. The greatest power she now held was not the inheritance itself. It was the freedom to build a life defined by her own values. Late summer arrived quietly in Atlanta. The warm evenings carried the soft sound of crickets outside the townhouse windows, and the air felt heavier with the deep heat that settled over the city each year. Inside the townhouse, Amélie had developed a rhythm that revolved around the final weeks of pregnancy. Doctor visits had become more frequent. Her movements had slowed as the weight of the baby made simple tasks more exhausting than before. Still, she remained calm, prepared. The small nursery room had been ready for weeks. Soft blankets rested neatly in the crib. Tiny clothes filled the dresser drawers. The rocking chair near the window had already become her favorite place to sit during quiet evenings. Sometimes she would rock slowly while imagining the future. A little girl learning to walk across the living room floor. First days of school. Laughter echoing through the house. Those thoughts gave her strength during the long nights when sleep became difficult. One early morning just before sunrise, something felt different. Amélie woke suddenly. A sharp pressure tightened across her stomach. She sat up slowly in bed, breathing carefully while waiting for the sensation to pass. But instead of fading, another wave followed, stronger this time. Emily placed both hands against her belly and took a steady breath. "So, this is it," she whispered softly. She moved carefully out of bed and prepared to leave for the hospital. The streets were still quiet when she arrived. Inside, the building felt calm but purposeful. People moved quickly through the hallways, and the distant sound of medical equipment hummed faintly behind closed doors. Soon, Emily found herself in a hospital room where the long process of labor began. Hours passed. Labor has a way of stretching time. Moments blur together between waves of pain and quiet stretches where breathing becomes the only focus. At times, Emily closed her eyes and concentrated on steady breaths. Other moments she gripped the side of the bed while another contraction moved through her body. But throughout the entire process, one thought remained constant. She was bringing her daughter into the world. Every difficult moment carried meaning. As the hours continued, exhaustion settled heavily across her shoulders. Yet something deeper than physical strength kept her moving forward. The determination that had guided her through every challenge since she was 16. Finally, late in the afternoon, the room filled with quiet urgency as the final stage of labor approached. Emily gathered the last of her strength. Her hands tightened against the sheets as one final effort pushed the moment forward. And then, a cry filled the room. Small, sharp, alive. The sound cut through the exhaustion instantly. Emily collapsed back against the pillows as tears filled her eyes. For a brief moment she could only listen to the tiny voice announcing its arrival into the world. A few seconds later, the newborn was placed gently into her arms. Emily looked down. The baby's face was small and warm, eyes still closed while tiny fingers curled softly against the blanket. The sight stole the breath from her chest. "Hello, beautiful girl," Emily whispered. Her voice trembled with emotion. The baby shifted slightly, letting out another soft cry before settling again. In that moment, something inside Emily changed. The pain of the past year, the betrayal, the loneliness, the uncertainty, suddenly felt smaller, because now she understood exactly why she had fought to stay strong. This child, this life, that was the future she had been protecting all along. Emily gently brushed her fingers across the baby's cheek. "You and me," she murmured softly. The tiny hand curled around her finger. Such a small grip, yet it felt powerful enough to anchor everything in her life. Outside the hospital window, evening sunlight began fading behind the skyline of Atlanta. But inside that quiet room, a completely new chapter had begun. Not defined by the past, not shaped by the choices Xavier had made, defined by the bond forming between a mother and her daughter. Emily leaned back against the pillows while holding the baby close to her chest. The exhaustion remained, but beneath it, a deep calm had taken its place. For the first time since that painful Easter Eve, she no longer felt like someone rebuilding from loss. She felt like someone standing at the beginning of something greater. Motherhood had arrived, and with it came a kind of strength no betrayal could ever take away. Nearly a year passed after the night Emily gave birth to her daughter. The townhouse that once felt quiet now carried a completely different energy. Morning sunlight often revealed toys scattered across the living room floor. Soft baby laughter echoed through the hallways, while Emily moved through her daily routine balancing work, motherhood, and the responsibilities connected to the company her mother had built. Life had grown busy, but it also felt grounded. Each day followed a rhythm shaped by simple priorities. Feeding her daughter, preparing for meetings related to the company, reviewing programs at the nonprofit organization she continued supporting. Some evenings she pushed a stroller through the neighborhood while the warm Atlanta air settled gently over the sidewalks. Neighbors waved as she passed. Many of them had watched her rebuild her life over the past year. And the woman walking beside that stroller carried a quiet confidence that hadn't existed before. Not because of money, because of experience. Raising her daughter alone had revealed strengths Emily hadn't known she possessed. Patience during sleepless nights, calm during unexpected challenges, a deeper understanding of responsibility. Every small moment with her daughter reinforced one belief. Her life had not been destroyed by Xavier's decision. It had simply taken a different direction. One evening in early spring, Emily attended a charity event in downtown Atlanta. The location felt strangely familiar. The same hotel ballroom where she had first met Xavier years earlier. Large chandeliers cast warm light across the room, while guests moved through small groups discussing philanthropy and business partnerships. But Emily entered the room differently this time. Her posture carried calm assurance. The elegant black dress she wore fit comfortably, and her expression remained relaxed as she greeted several people who recognized her work supporting mentorship programs. For a while, the evening moved normally. Conversations flowed, glasses clinked during quiet toasts. Then a voice behind her spoke a name she hadn't heard in months. Emily. She turned slowly. Xavier stood a few steps away. He looked older than she remembered, not dramatically, but the confident ease he once carried had faded slightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Xavier offered a careful smile. "You look incredible," he said. Emily nodded politely. "Hello, Xavier." The brief greeting carried no bitterness, just distance. His eyes searched her face as if trying to read something he once understood easily. "I've been hoping I might see you here tonight," he said. She waited quietly for him to continue. Xavier took a small breath. "I heard about your mother's company," he said. The sentence revealed exactly how information had reached him. "Wealth moves quickly through certain social circles." "I'm not surprised," Emily replied calmly. Xavier hesitated. "I made a mistake," he said finally. The words arrived quickly, as if he had rehearsed them many times before this moment. "I didn't understand what I was giving up." Emily studied him for a moment. Then she asked a question in the same steady voice she had used during their final conversation in the kitchen months earlier. "Are you talking about our marriage?" she asked. "Or the inheritance?" The question landed harder than he expected. Xavier looked briefly at the floor before answering. "I'm talking about you." Emily held his gaze for several seconds. Then she shook her head gently. "You didn't lose me because of money," she said quietly. "You lost me the night you walked away from your pregnant wife." The truth settled between them. Xavier swallowed. "I thought I understood what I wanted," he said. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know I was wrong." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say more. Perhaps to ask for another chance, but Emily's expression remained calm, not angry, simply certain. "You can't repair something you chose to break," she said softly. Xavier nodded slowly. The weight of that reality seemed to settle heavily across his shoulders. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Can I see my daughter?" Emily paused. The room around them continued buzzing with quiet conversations, but their moment felt strangely private. Finally, she nodded. "Yes." Hope flickered briefly in Xavier's eyes, but Emily continued speaking. "Not because we're rebuilding anything between us," she said, "because she deserves to know where she comes from." Xavier accepted the answer quietly. "I understand." Emily gave him a final nod. "I wish you well, Xavier." Then she turned and walked away. No anger, no dramatic exit, just forward movement toward the life she had built without him. And as Emily crossed the ballroom, one truth remained clear in her heart. The greatest victory in life is not proving someone wrong. It is building a life so full of peace, purpose, and love that the people who once doubted you no longer matter. Before you go, take a moment and think about Emily's journey. She was abandoned while carrying a child, forced to rebuild her life from the ground up, and yet she refused to become bitter. Instead, she chose dignity, purpose, and love for the life she was bringing into the world. That's the kind of strength many people never talk about. If Emily's story moved you even a little, share this video with someone who might need this reminder tonight, that your life is never over just because someone else walks away. Sometimes the door that closes is the very thing that leads you to the future you were meant to have. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe and join our family here at Mr. Graham Stories.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.